Good morning. This is Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black. Today we're going to have a very special guest, Jim Jatras, with us. This is Monday, August 14th, and our topic today is going to be the question, is Russia achieving moral supremacy? But before that, I'm going to make a few remarks about an article that came out of the Hill, a website called The Hill, came out several days ago, and it was entitled, "Alarm Grows as Ukraine's Counteroffensive Falters." Now, it's very interesting. You know, this counteroffensive has been going on for months, and I think the direction and the progress of the counteroffensive was apparent almost within the first week after they began the battle. But with the tremendous volume of Western propaganda and sort of the unity of the Western media, it has been very difficult for the public to discern what was going on, even though those of us who follow very closely could tell early on that the counterattack was failing. But just a few notes on it. The Hill says there's growing alarm about the pace and prospects of Ukraine's counteroffensive, with few signs of progress in recent weeks, and Russian lines holding strong. Then CNN quotes certain unnamed U.S. officials saying that significant progress was highly unlikely, and especially with fall and winter fast approaching. The progress of military action in Ukraine is very, very weather dependent, and at certain times of year, the mud becomes so difficult that you can hardly move in it. So it looks like the window of opportunity is closing. There are two major offensives that Ukraine has launched. The biggest one is south of Zaporizhia, headed towards the Black Sea. And then there is a smaller offensive towards Bakhmut, which is the Ukrainian word for the town. Tremendous slaughter occurred in Bakhmut, and Ukraine the Russians won the battle, biggest battle in Europe since the Second World War, and Ukraine has been trying to regain the initiative and retake Bakhmut. But in any event, they faced major obstacles from dug-in trenches, minefields, Russian air superiority, and the superior Russian artillery. So the latest thing is the White House is doubling down, and they're requesting another $13 billion for Ukraine, a total of $40 billion. $40 billion here, $40 billion there. But in any event, that is where things stand on the battlefield. But with that, Jim Jatras, as some of you know, has been with us several times before. He was a very, very accomplished foreign policy expert who worked with the Senate, the United States Senate, for many years. So, Jim, welcome, and we'll let you talk a little bit.
Well, thank you, Senator. I think you've summed up very well the situation on the ground in terms of the military struggle. Many people said before the Ukrainians launched this offensive that it could not possibly succeed. And unfortunately, those predictions have been borne out at a just horrendous toll of men and material that has been just thrown down the rat hole for no purpose, just for political headlines. So now the question is, what happens next? A lot of people have been expecting that once the Ukrainian reserves are exhausted, that the Russians will do something on the offensive side that would maybe help bring this war to a close. We really don't know. But I think one of the issues you wanted to deal with today is the fact that unlike what a lot of people think, that this is somehow just a turf battle, that there really is a strong moral component to this war, that somehow the Western powers backing up Ukraine have insisted on turning this into some kind of a war on behalf of woke values. I can remember about a year ago that a MI6 British intelligence official was saying what this is really about is that the West and Ukraine support rainbow rights for everybody, and Russia does not, so it's a bad country. And now we see this spokesman for the Ukrainian armed forces, spokesperson, spokesthing, I don't know, who goes by the name of Sarah Ashton Cirillo, saying that the real purpose of this war is that Ukraine supports transgender rights and Russia does not. In fact, Russians are not even human beings because they don't support our, whoever our is, concept of rights. That's one reason I've been referring on Twitter or X or what do we call it now to this as World War Trans, that there is no transatlanticism without transgenderism, that this has now been made by America and our Western European allies as a crusade for the rainbow flag. And I don't know how many Americans buy into this. Frankly, I don't think most Ukrainians buy into this. This is something being shoved down Ukraine's throat, even as we're pushing more and more of their manpower into essentially a black hole of destruction for no logical reason, but running the risks increasingly of a direct clash between Russia and NATO, which could have incalculable consequences if it escalates out of control to the nuclear level. And what's amazing to me, Senator, is how few Americans seem to be paying any attention to it. And this is extremely dangerous as well as morally wrong.
You know, it is interesting. If you go back to the anti-war days of the Vietnam War, it was the left that was opposed to the war principally, and the Middle America was supportive of the war, and I think what gave so much energy to it was that the left didn't like the idea of the draft. They didn't want to risk their hides for somebody else. But now there's been a shift, and if it's interesting watching who opposes the war, and typically it's the right, it's the conservatives, and I think at least one element of it is the notion that Christians, conservatives, they don't want to get on board with a crusade for sodomy. It's interesting all across the globe. The promotion of sodomy has become a vital national interest of the United States under Obama and now under Biden. And it's much of the world rejects this idea. And at the same time that, we know that there are countries that are very deeply Christian or very deeply Islamic. And yet in every one of these countries, we're flying the rainbow sodomy flag beneath the national ensign. And I cannot imagine that in Afghanistan, which is a very fundamentalist Muslim country, we were doing this. And if ever you want to create perfect propaganda for the other side to use throughout the nation, it's to say, well, look, here's the United States. they're backing the groomers, the pedophiles, and all these people. And what is this all about? It's if you look at what's happening right now in Africa, there's just an entire continent is turning against the United States. And you've seen, I'm sure, what's happening in Niger.
Yes, this somehow is becoming the collective religion of the West to promote all these values, calling it democracy and human rights, and trying to impose it on the rest of the world. You're right to mention Africa. Even under the Trump administration, this had still become a policy of the American government to try to force other countries, especially in Africa, to change their laws regarding same-sex relations. This is becoming a litmus test everywhere. I noticed that in Greece, for example, that the newly reelected so-called conservative government now says it's going to push to have same-sex marriage enacted in Greece, which is just something that most people don't accept. But after all, if they want to be part of the West, or they want to be part of the EU and NATO and democracy and human rights, they have to accept this. Another thing that we mentioned in our private discussion yesterday is how much promotion of abortion has become a part of the Western religion as well. And Russia still, of course, has legal abortion. We know that the Soviet Union in 1920 was the first European country to legalize abortion. That was sort of a Bolshevik, godless, atheist value that they imposed on Russia. Oddly enough, it was changed under Stalin, who made it illegal again. And then it was re-legalized in 1955 under the liberal Khrushchev regime there. Russia is very progressively tightening up on abortion. Their law now is that it's only illegal before the 12th week, which is very bad in my opinion, but it's a lot better than most U.S. states, including here in Virginia. So, I think that's part of the reason that so much of the Western world hates Russia, that it's trying to recover its Christian values after decades of godless communism. And that's one reason, by the way, we also see not a peep out of the U.S. government over the persecution of the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine, that we now see bishops being sent to jail, that monasteries and churches being taken over by the state in order to give them to a schismatic group supported by the government. There's so much of a religious and moral, spiritual nature that's being bound up in this war, to which I think most Americans are totally oblivious. They have no idea. So you mentioned Vietnam and the left and so forth. I do wonder where the left is. Where is the anti-war left? But what is really dismaying to me as a conservative is how many Americans who are concerned about the overreach of our government, concerned about things like promotion of rainbow values in the school, who then assume that when we go abroad, it's all mom and apple pie, that, the United States stands up for truth, justice, and the American way, when in fact, it's the very same godless agenda we see coming from our elites here at home. And they don't seem to understand that the same kind of value is being promoted by the Unit Party, by the Biden regime and their Republican collaborators, is the very same values that we promote abroad as well.
Yeah, it is interesting. If you look at American history going way back, I mean, back into the 1800s, but more so in the 1900s and on, we have this force that promotes various foreign policy objectives, totally independent of the interests and desires of the American people. We even entering the Second World War, right up until Pearl Harbor, there was just like 80% of the American people were against going into war, and yet all of the steps were, all of the preparations were put in place to get us into war. It started back in the 30s, and this U.S. State Department and this sort of foreign policy enterprise that includes DOD and so forth, they just sort of roll on. And the worry is that as much as the American public is beginning to sour on Ukraine, that you've got this elite that may just decide, regardless of us, that they're just going to shift over to nuclear weapons. And I don't know that anyone really controls them. To some extent, the president has a strong voice, but you look at what happened to Trump. I think the reason that Trump was undermined was because he came out against NATO, and I think that's the holy grail. That's one of the foundational elements of the New World Order, where we have a higher level government, higher than the U.S. government or the German government, but it's sort of ethereal, and it will govern what the world does and where populations shift around and that kind of thing. But it's interesting watching what is unfolding in Russia, because I've watched now for some years, and they just recently President Putin signed a law banning sex change in Russia, and it prohibits the sexual mutilation of children, which is legal in most places in the United States. Russia has recently, as you mentioned, they have a 12-week limit on abortion, which is better than most states in the United States. But also, there's one of the Russian internal republics that has now banned abortion propaganda. So in that particular part of Russia, Mordovia, if you publish an article saying, women should have the right to an abortion, that is a criminal offense now. And apparently there's great unity in Mordovia about doing it. And the head of that particular republic says the number of abortions is decreasing. 5 private clinics have already voluntarily refused to commit anything regarding abortion. But the Russia itself has cracked down, and they made it a crime to advocate homosexuality. So, and it's a criminal offense, even if you're dealing with other adults. So it's not just trying to groom children, but so there's a sort of a tremendous drive to return to the traditional moral values, I guess, pre-Bolshevik times. And it's just kind of ironic that it's happening in Russia, where under the Bolsheviks, that's where abortion started, and the acceptance of homosexuality. That, I think a lot of that came out of the Bolshevik Revolution as well.
That's right, and I think you're right to say that this is something that is hearkening back to the pre-revolutionary period, before the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917. And what's paradoxical about this, Senator, is that some people seem to think that anti-Russian feeling in the West is largely a holdover from the Cold War. And maybe that's true among some conservatives who don't realize that this is not a communist country anymore. But what is striking to me is how many people in the West are more anti-Russian today against a non-communist Russia than they ever were against the Soviet Union. I mean, you never saw this kind of hatred directed against the Soviet Union or against Soviet leaders like Khrushchev or Brezhnev or even Stalin as you do against Vladimir Putin today. Why is that? Now, I can tell you, as somebody who once was on the Soviet desk at the State Department and was known as one of the most rigid anti-communists there were very few anti-communists at the State Department. There was this kind of sense that, oh, well, communism is not our cup of tea, but it's fundamentally a progressive ideology, and socialism would be a good thing if it weren't in the hands of those brutal Russians. It would work out much better. We essentially are the same values. We're godless, we're globalists, and so on and so forth. And there was kind of a goodwill and presumption of partnership when it came to the communist regime in Russia. But when communism ended, and then we saw a national, increasingly Christian Russia coming back, oh, that was beyond the pale. We can't accept that. We either have to keep them completely under our thumb, as we had under Yeltsin, or now when Putin is in charge and is not really taking his orders from Washington or London or Brussels and so forth, that we have to destroy this country. And let's not forget, how did we get to this mess in Ukraine? By a Western coup in 2014 to make Ukraine into a NATO salient against Russia and build it up as a great military force, and also to try to crush the Russian-speaking regions in the in the east of the country. And now we have a war on our hands that may tip into a nuclear holocaust if we're not careful, all because of this irrational hatred on the part of the Western leaders who are dedicated to these anti-Christian, I would say anti-human, even satanistic values that we're trying to impose on the rest of mankind. In a way, what really happened when the first Cold War ended in 1991 is that the United States and its satellites emerged as kind of a new Soviet Union, trying to impose these so-called progressive values on the rest of the world. And that's why the world is teetering on the brink of a global conflagration. And most Americans, either they don't care or they don't know, or they're even actively on the side of the people who are driving this agenda. And I think it's really time that Americans listen to people like you, Senator, and we need a wake-up call in this country. And I don't know where this can go. That's what concerns me as an American.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Just turning on the news this morning, down in LA, they had a really massive smash and grab. Had about 50 of young black fellows who ran in and just they raided a Nordstrom. They took everything of value. They pepper sprayed the guards. I think they used bear spray, and they immobilized the guards. We in American cities, we just have this lawlessness, this breakdown of law and order. I think partly stemming from indoctrination in critical race theory. And then at the same time, we have this moral collapse taking place. There was an interesting article in PBS. They have some sort of a network, and they were talking about the crisis in military recruitments. And they didn't focus a whole lot on the moral aspects, but I can tell you that there are a lot of Christian conservatives who tend to make up the core of the military, and they don't go in because their parents, people like me, I have about as much combat experience, I suppose, as anybody living these days, and I don't advise people to go in the military because the moral environment has just decayed so much, and there is so much racial discrimination in the services, which wasn't the case before. But here, just really, if this doesn't tell you everything, the Navy has named a ship after Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk was famous because he was a homosexual member of I forget, I think it was San Francisco, where he was a member of the Board of Supervisors or whatever. But anyway, Harvey Milk, he's a notorious homosexual pedophile whose claim to fame is that he was a pedophile who was assassinated. And he had received a bad discharge from the Navy. They kicked him out. They booted him out. There's not much record, not much of a paper record, but my guess is that it had something to do with his misbehavior as a homosexual. But in any event, here's a guy who is a known, acknowledged pedophile, homosexual pedophile. And what do? We name a Navy ship after him. Now, I can imagine, if my son had joined the Navy and he says, oh, Dad, I've been assigned to the USS Harvey Milk. I mean, I don't know what, I'd probably tell him, you need to go AWOL because that's a ship of rape and you don't need to be on it. But I mean, I think we've got Latin America, we have Africa, and they're sort of becoming hostile towards us because of our morality. And I believe you were talking with me last night about Asia, that while it's not so much a matter of the morality, it's more a question of rationality for them. Didn't you say that?
That's right. I mean, you mentioned that there are countries that have a strong Christian tradition. Others have a strong Islamic tradition. But when we look at, East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, there are a lot of Christians in Korea. There are a lot in China, but those are not the main ethos of those countries. They have their own very ancient traditions that are not specifically Christian, but nonetheless, they at least understand reality. I mean, even a normal, irreligious, even pagan country understands normal human life, that, men and women get married, they have children, you have families, and they have their ancestors whom they honor and so forth. All of that's being thrown down the drain by the Western countries now, who think that they can sort of create a new world out of nothing. And I'm glad you mentioned this incident in California with this robbery and this lawlessness going on in our cities. That's another parallel with Bolshevism. One of the first things the Bolsheviks did when they seized power is they emptied all the prisons and turned all the murderers and rapists and robbers loose and told them to go do what they do, because this is revolutionary action. They are part of the socially friendly class fighting against the established old world that needs to be destroyed. It's this kind of moral nihilism that is at the root of again, the word woke tends to be overused, but the woke agenda is essentially a rebellion against the created order, against God himself, and the idea that there's any kind of rationality, any logos to the world as God made it, and to human beings as God created them. Even if you're not a believer, you understand that there's still a normal human life, a normal order to human society, and our rulers have rejected even that, and that's what we're trying to impose on the rest of the world, and willing to risk destruction of the world in order to achieve it.
Yeah, we don't know quite where we're going. We have a commenter here who mentions that NATO is now out of shells. They have gotten to the point where they've they don't know what the next step is, and that NATO is a paper tiger, and I think there's a great deal of truth in that. But the danger is that NATO is a foundation of American imperial power. Our grip on Europe is through NATO. The U.S. controls NATO, and NATO controls Europe. And I've heard predictions that that the fall of Ukraine, or the collapse of Ukraine, and the victory of Russia will end NATO. But I'm not at all sure. I think that NATO is so fundamental to the New World Order that the danger is that the people who make our foreign policy, and it's not made in Congress, it's not all made by the president, but that those people within the State Department, the people that they correspond with in London, the boys from Davos, that the decision might be made, this is too big to risk. Our moral values, our commitment to sodomy, to transgenderism, to racial hatred, all of those things that really make up our moral fabric as the deep state, are at risk. And it is worth taking down the world to prevent the fall of NATO. So that it does concern me. I know Doug McGregor, who is very, very respected, prominent, says that he feels that we're entering perhaps the most dangerous phase of this war, because as Ukraine falters, as they stumble, then there will be increasing desperation to do something, to somehow pull a rabbit out of the hat. And we're certainly at that point, because the London Telegraph is describing the counterattack as a faltering counterattack. Yahoo News asks, is Ukraine's counterattack turning out to be a bust? And Responsible Statecraft reports why Ukraine's counteroffensive is failing. I think one of the reasons that the support for this war is ebbing is because in order to support this whole one world order enterprise, it almost flies in the face of God. That now we're supposed to be on board with Zelensky, who is putting forward an American transgender guy who wears a woman's dress as one of their spokesmen, and Zelensky just decides, well, I'm gonna raid the monasteries and the churches and arrest priests and nuns. And by the way, I'm going to change the date of Christmas. Because why? Well, I don't know. It's just, these church people are a pain in the rear anyway. So we're going to change the date of Christmas. And I don't know where it leads us. I think Ukraine, unfortunately, they've been a pawn in a great global chess game. And they're going to be a nation of widows and orphans, that this war will impact them for 100 years from now. And in the meantime, we are reaching that desperate point where the U.S. is kind of out of stuff. We don't have the military power to take on Russia on the ground. And and we're going to be tempted to do something terribly, terribly rash at some point. That's what I fear. So, well, Jim, you want to have a few remarks before I close things out?
Just very briefly, I think you're right. Colonel McGregor has mentioned that we're probably in the maximum danger zone over the next few weeks or months, where these people in NATO could very well do something very stupid to try to rescue the situation. I mean, if you look at the Vilnius summit last month, they really planted their feet in concrete. I mean, they basically defined no other possible outcome to this war than Russia's total defeat. And they don't seem to understand, even if we could achieve that, which we can't, even we could achieve that, if you really want to force a nuclear power into an existential crisis in its own neighborhood, you're really asking for Armageddon. And they don't seem to understand that. I mean, I have to assume they don't understand that. They're not doing this deliberately, but we could see some kind of an incursion, maybe by Poland and Lithuania with American support, into Western Ukraine, or some kind of incident in the Black Sea. We've even had people floating the idea we should be reflagging Ukrainian ships like we did in the Persian Gulf some decades ago, and then be using American military force to escort those ships, which would, a war in the Black Sea, a naval war in the Black Sea, is a total loser for America militarily. But again, people are thinking along these lines, evidently. So yeah, over the next few weeks and months, we'll have to see. And then of course the other side is, do the Russians entertain some kind of fantasy that if they play their cards in a very restrained way, that somehow normal people and the people who want to try to extricate themselves will come to the fore? Unfortunately, I think they just send a signal that restraint equals weakness, that just incite these people to greater risk. So, we all need to keep praying and hoping that that doesn't happen, and somehow this thing can wind down without a major explosion that will be uncontrollable. But it's a very real danger that nobody is really paying attention to, I'm afraid.
Well, I think you're right, Jim. With the presidential election coming up, it's going to certainly put a lot of pressure on the question of whether we continue the Ukraine war. And of course, with the sort of breaking out of this whole story of the Biden crime family and the shakedowns of different nations for money, it has finally begun to undermine the president himself, and so desperate people do rash things, and it is definitely a time of danger. I certainly pray and hope that we can return some rationality to our foreign policy, and I appreciate, Jim, particularly your comment about the Soviet desk. We'll have to talk more about that later, but it's interesting hearing your comments about the atmosphere surrounding the Soviet desk. But in any event, I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us. Please join us again next Monday at 11. And of course, we're on podcast on Twitter whenever you like to tune in. The address for Twitter is @SEN Richard Black. So we hope to see you again. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.